Hi there, folks. I'm here to do a Facebook Live webinar for the next hour or so to answer your questions, particularly about the Fair Deal Panel report, which was released earlier today. I held a news conference with Alicia Lenny, chair of that panel, and it made 25 important recommendations about how Alberta can get a fair deal in the Canadian Federation, a number of ways to maximize our leverage in the Federation, things like reforming equalization, challenging it through a referendum, the possibility of a provincial police force, possibility of a provincial pension plan, many other recommendations. So if you have questions about that, please enter them into the comments section below, and we'll try to take a good cross-section of questions. If you have questions that are really burning for you that are not on this topic of the fair deal or Alberta's role with Ottawa, for example, that's good. We'll try to get to a few of those as well, but we were hoping to focus on issues about Alberta's place in Canada. And let me just begin by saying thank you to the folks who worked on the Fair Deal panel. I've got their report is right here. It's available online. I would ask our team to please put a link to the report in the comments section below so you can go and click on the link, get it yourself. I want to thank the chair, Alicia Lenny. Alicia worked with Premier Peter Lougheed back nearly 30 years ago in fighting the National Energy Program and the patriation of the Constitution in the early 1980s, and more recently was a Deputy Minister of Western Economic Diversification for the federal government. A very highly respected woman who was a strong champion of Alberta's rights and role. We also had Preston Manning, whose father occupied this office for 30 years as Premier, Ernst Manning, and Preston, of course, founder of the Reform Party. Appreciate his presence on the task force, as well as Stephen Lougheed, whose dad also occupied this office. Between the two of them, their dads were premiers of Alberta for almost 50 years, and appreciate Stephen's role. We had Donna Kennedy Glanz, former minister and lawyer from Calgary, and Moin Yaha, professor of law at the University of Alberta, as well as MLAs Tani Yao, Miranda Rosen, and Drew Barnes. And finally, a dear friend of mine, Chief Jason Goodstriker of the Blackfoot people, who sadly passed away in January, halfway through the work of the Fair Deal panel. And they've dedicated the panel to his, the report rather, to his memory. So, and I would like to repeat my appreciation for all of their work, but particularly for the role of my friend, the late Stephen Buff, the late Jason Goodstriker, excuse me, and I want to say thank you to all of the panelists who were there. We're going now to take your first question. I should just maybe quickly say that of the 25 recommendations made by the panel, today on behalf of the Government of Alberta, I accepted 23 of those recommendations, indicating that we're already have work underway on many of them. Some do require further in-depth technical study, really big complex issues like the prospective Alberta Provincial Police Force or pension plan. And there's two recommendations that we did not endorse because they are contrary to election platform commitments that we made. One of them about converting tax point transfers to, cash transfers from Ottawa to tax point transfers, for example, and another about setting up a provincial revenue agency. We want to keep our options open about that. But essentially we've accepted, as I say, 23 of the 25 recommendations, some doing additional analysis before we submit them to Albertans for a final decision. All right, I'm going to go straight to your questions now. First goes to Jason Renwick. Why is it going to take so long to bring in a referendum, and why wasn't separation utilized as a bargaining chip? Thanks, Jason. First of all, in our platform that we ran on in last year's election, we committed to a possible referendum on the principle of equalization in October of 2021. And so we're still on track to keep that commitment. And one of the reasons that we deliberately placed that kind of midway through our mandate, Jason, was to use that as a point of leverage with Ottawa to get a positive response on a number of our demands for fairness. So that would include lifting the cap on the so-called fiscal stabilization program, which I regard as a kind of equalization rebate, repealing Bill C-69, getting the Trans Mountain Pipeline built, and a number of other issues. My view, Jason, is if we blow all of our kind of ammunition very early on, then we don't have points of leverage as we deal with Ottawa on many of those issues. And all right, Rick Blaskevich says, what happens if I'm on CPP and the province decides to have its own CPP? Well, Rick, nobody would lose their benefits. I have tasked the Department of Finance with doing a in-depth technical study on the cost, benefits, and potential structure of an Alberta provincial pension plan. There are many different ways that your issue could be addressed. You know, for example, and theoretically, we could accept all of the liabilities of the Canada Pension Plan and just begin paying out those benefits directly to beneficiaries. Another way of going would be just to do this prospectively, so we would set up a new pension plan starting at some date in the future. The CPP would continue to pay out notionally the benefits of up to that date, and then Alberta would assume any liabilities going forward. All of this would have to be subject, of course, to negotiations with the federal government. I would just point out a couple of things, though, Rick, about the idea of a Alberta pension plan. It is very clear that it would result in either lower payroll taxes or higher benefits, or both, because Alberta has the youngest population in the country, and our participation in the Canada Pension Plan represents about a $3 billion a year net fiscal transfer from Albertans, from basically younger Alberta workers who are paying those payroll taxes, to older beneficiaries in the Eastern and Central Canada. So this is the single largest element of the $20 billion net fiscal contribution that Alberta makes to the rest of the Federation each year, over which we do have potential control. Secondly, I would point out that Quebec has successfully operated its own provincial pension plan for about 6 decades, and so if we were to go in this direction, it would be modeled in part on the, I would say, the success of the Quebec provincial pension plan. And then thirdly, by keeping those premiums here in Alberta, investing those through our own pension board, we would have greater purchasing power, at which through our investments that would allow us to invest in a larger class of assets. It would also allow us to invest across a greater diversity of assets, minimizing risk. So there are a lot of, I think, compelling reasons why an Alberta pension plan may make sense, but at the end of the day, we have a lot of very complex technical questions to get into. The Department of Finance will be doing that. They'll report back next year. Ultimately, if the advice is that this would be a net benefit for Albertans, we would submit the prospective creation of an Alberta provincial pension plan to Alberta voters in a referendum for you to have the last say. All right, Danielle Von Tkach says, how would a pension plan work for people who work in Alberta and reside in other provinces like Saskatchewan and Newfoundland? Again, that's exactly one of the questions, Danielle, that the Department of Finance is going to address in their in-depth technical study, which they'll be beginning and releasing in 2021, which is the portability of benefits, for example, across the country, because you've had people maybe who worked for a few months in Alberta and then in a different province. How would we disaggregate those or honor those pension benefits with a provincial administration? I think a lot of that has already been answered by the way the Quebec provincial pension plan operates. If you're in Alberta and you go and work in Quebec, for example, the portability of those benefits is already addressed. All right, Dermot Cahill, it's a good Irish name, says, what's the ultimatum if Ottawa won't negotiate? Well, Dermot, at least one of the ultimata is the referendum on the principle of equalization in the Canadian Constitution that we're tentatively scheduling for October of next year. This would, I believe, elevate Alberta's fight for fairness to the top of the national agenda in a way similar to what Quebec has done so effectively in recent decades. And I would ask you to read the report, and you can see that a number of these are areas where we would really be maximizing leverage within the Federation. Oh, I forgot the very first question from Jason, and I think implicit in your question, Dermot, is the question of separation. And the panel did not recommend that we pursue separation or that we use that as a threat. Let me say that it's no secret, I am, as I believe the vast majority of Albertans are, I'm a patriot. I have, and my family have had an attachment to this country. My family has served in the uniform of Canada's military going back, well, before Confederation actually, in the defense of British North America. My dad was a Royal Canadian Air Force fighter pilot, and a disproportionate number of people who serve in the Canadian military come from Alberta. We are patriots. And I think we also understand that a landlocked Alberta would be a poor Alberta, an Alberta that has no access to coastlines, that does not have access to the US market through NAFTA, would not be a rich Alberta, it would be a landlocked Alberta. I lead a party, the United Conservatives, one of whose founding principles was a belief in a united Canada. Having said all of that, it is clear that Alberta has been treated unfairly in the Federation, particularly in recent years with the blockage of pipelines and anti-energy policies. And that's exactly why our government was elected on a mandate to fight for a fair deal. It's why we've appointed this panel, and it's why we've endorsed 23 of its 25 recommendations. All right, Jenny Nielsen says, why wait until 2020 to have a referendum? This seems like stalling. I've already answered that, but I'll just repeat it quickly, which is to say, no, there's no stalling here. This is about, playing chess and not checkers. This is about being strategic and not just tactical. This is about trying to maximize our leverage in the Federation, because we have so many ways in which Alberta is being treated unfairly that we need to maximize our leverage. And if we just go and use all of our ammunition immediately, then we lose that leverage. It is existential for us and our economic future, for example, that we see the completion and the commissioning of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Guess who owns that? The Government of Canada. It is essential for our fiscal future that we get a retroactive and prospective lifting of the cap on fiscal stabilization, which is a kind of equalization rebate. And there's so many other critical issues where we are fighting for fairness, and to use all of the most powerful tools that we have right now would be to, be playing your strongest card in a card game right off the top in your first hand. That's not strategically smart in my judgment. And secondly, this is what we committed to in our platform. We're keeping our word. All right, T.O. says, why did you write the federal transfer policy the way it was? It wasn't fair to Alberta in the first place. Well, T, I did not write the federal transfer policy. The federal transfer policy effectively has existed for most of the period since the Second World War. It really was developed in the 1960s. Some of these transfers existed since the 1940s, but it really took its current form, frankly, before I was born, in the 1960s with I'll call it the complex system of fiscal federalism, of which equalization is just one part. I'll give you an example. Every year, Albertans, through our federal taxes, contribute about $20 billion more to Ottawa, and therefore the rest of the country, than we get back in transfers and benefits to Alberta. And only about $3 billion of that $20 billion comes through the Equalization program. This is the whole complex system of transfers. I mentioned earlier the Canada Pension Plan is one form, one aspect of fiscal federalism, where younger Alberta workers end up subsidizing benefits for older retirees in Eastern Canada. So all of those programs have existed since at least the 1960s. They have been modified from time to time. You may be referring to the equalization formula, which has been modified. It was modified when Stephen Harper was in government. The NDP in Alberta have said that I wrote it. The truth is I was the Minister of Immigration, Minister of Employment, and Minister of Defence, and so did not write the equalization program that has existed for decades. It was the responsibility of the Minister of Finance. I can tell you, though, that Stephen Harper's government did make reforms that reduced Quebec's eligibility for the program, reduced the amount of money they have received. You may recall that Newfoundland was very upset to the point where they refused to fly the Canadian flag in St. John's because they thought they weren't getting enough money out of it. And there were other important fiscal reforms for fairness under the Harper government. For example, the Harper government went to a fair per capita formula for the Canada Health Transfer, which gave Alberta an extra $1 billion a year. I will just say this, when the equalization formula was last reformed by the Harper government about, I think, 7 or 8 years ago, at that time, we were in a boom here in Alberta. Other parts of the country were in much tougher economic times than us. Secondly, we did not have provinces or Ottawa blocking our pipelines and trying to landlock our resources. And I will restate what I say all the time, which is I don't believe that Albertans begrudge our fellow Canadians a reasonable portion of the energy wealth that is developed here when times are good here and bad elsewhere. I think we're proud to be able to develop our resources and share with our fellow Canadians to maintain a decent standard of living across the country, as long as the rest of the country allows us to develop the resources that pay the tab in this federation. And that is something that's fundamentally changed in the past several years with provincial and federal governments that have brought in anti-energy policies to landlock our largest resource. So those things are all significantly different. But again, the notion that I somehow invented fiscal federalism or equalization is just completely false. And having said that, what we are trying to do as a provincial government, here's one last point. In the years that I spent as a Alberta MP in Ottawa, I never once recall an Alberta government minister or MLA asking us to fundamentally change the equalization formula. That has obviously changed, as Alberta is now in a deep economic trough, and other parts of the country like Quebec have very strong growth. We have a big deficit, they have large surpluses. So all of these things have changed, and that's one of the reasons we're asking for fairness with respect to equalization. Ron Stewart Hudson Foster says, Mr. Kenney, when are we going to take steps to protect Alberta against what is unfolding in this country? Well, Ron, I would say that we are taking steps. And I know sometimes I see here on Facebook people say that our government isn't doing enough to act, and we're only talking about these things. So bear with me a second when I talk about some of the steps that we have taken to protect Alberta, the real actions we have taken. Bill number 1 last year, we repealed the NDP carbon tax. Then when Justin Trudeau imposed his federal carbon tax on us, we kept our word and sued him with a judicial reference at the Alberta Appeal Court, which we won in an historic 4-1 vote this February. We've also kept our word to support the legal challenges by Saskatchewan and Ontario of the federal carbon tax. We've kept our word to form a coalition across the country against things like the carbon tax and Bill C-69. In the case of the carbon tax, we've actually got Quebec joining us in the Supreme Court of Canada, where this is ultimately going to be decided. On Bill C-69, we managed to get 187 amendments, including all of those adopted by Alberta's government, made to the No More Pipelines law by the Senate of Canada. Unfortunately, those were reversed by Trudeau, and that's why we are now keeping our word to a constitutional challenge of the No More Pipelines law, and that's a decision that will be forthcoming from the Alberta Appeal Court. We kept our word to create an Indigenous litigation fund to get pro-development First Nations a stronger legal voice to fight for common sense policies. And so through that fund, we're supporting an Alberta First Nation that's suing the Trudeau government for its unconstitutional tanker ban, C-48. On the first day our government was sworn in May of last year, we proclaimed into law the Preserving Canada's Economic Prosperity Act, the so-called Turn Off the Taps legislation, that would give us the power to restrict energy shipments to provinces if, for example, they seek to restrict or block pipelines. For example, have kept our word to challenge the federal Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation stress test that has put the dream of home ownership out of the reach of tens of thousands of Albertans. We've fought for employment insurance reforms, which treat Albertans unfairly. We have introduced legislation in the legislature, keeping our campaign commitment to create an Alberta parole board that will make decisions that are much more based on our real experience here in Alberta. We've kept our commitment to get cross-country support for resource and energy corridors. We had 12 of the 13 provinces and territories sign on to that concept for energy and resource corridors. We've kept our word to promote free trade within the country because we're all made poorer by barriers to trade and labor mobility. We've gone from being one of the least open provinces for domestic trade to the most open by eliminating 80% of our exemptions under the Canada Free Trade Agreement. I could go on. The point is on many, many issues. We've already taken those actions, and now we'll be taking even more, informed in part by the recommendations of the Fair Deal panel. All right, Kim Hula-Etu says, what do you personally want for Alberta and Canada? What I personally want is a fair deal for Alberta in Canada, a prosperous Alberta in a prosperous and free Canada. I believe that you can only have a strong Canada if you have a strong Alberta. And I will not allow one bad set of policies or one government that I disagree with make me and 4+ million Albertans make us feel unwelcome in our country. We are patriots, and we have done so much to contribute to Canada. We have contributed over $600 billion net to the rest of the Federation since about 1960. We have been the great job creation engine of the modern Canadian economy. We have been a magnet for people who faced poverty and underemployment or unemployment in other parts of the country who came to Alberta for the thrill of opportunity and the dignity of work. That's the Alberta I want, where we continue to be that shining light on a hill, if you will, that beacon of hope and opportunity with a deep culture of enterprise. And unfortunately, we still have those values. We have those people. We have those resources. But we also have a set of policies in other parts of the country that have sought to block us in and pin us down. And I want to be liberated from those policies through this fair deal. Kenward Wong says, what legal leverage does Alberta have to see that we get a fair deal? Well, there's a lot of different legal leverage. I've mentioned some of the legal strategies we've been using, Ken. For example, the successful challenge of the federal carbon tax, where we won on a 4-1 decision at the Alberta Court of Appeal. Now that's going to go to the Supreme Court. Our constitutional challenge of the No More Pipelines Law, C-69, our support for an Indigenous challenge to the tanker ban, C-48. So there are those and other legal avenues that we will be using. For example, we're looking at potentially supporting a legal challenge of the recent federal gun grab, which we think is totally unwarranted and targets law-abiding Canadians rather than gangsters and criminals. So there's lots of legal levers that we can use. One legal lever would be holding this constitutional referendum on equalization, because under the 1998 Quebec secession reference decision of Canada's Supreme Court, if a province holds a referendum on a constitutional amendment, and it's a clear question with a clear majority voting in favor, that imposes on Ottawa an obligation to negotiate that amendment with that province in good faith. That is our reading of the Quebec secession reference, and that's the legal logic that lies behind the proposed referendum on equalization that the Fair Deal panel has endorsed. So I could go on, Ken, but there's just a number of different legal levers at our disposal. But let me be clear about some things that are not at our disposal. I often see on Facebook and elsewhere, people say, well, why don't you just stop sending the money to Ottawa, stop the transfers from going to Ottawa. I wish we could, but we do not have that power, because the transfers, the whole system of fiscal federalism, the transfers that go through Ottawa, those are funded entirely, 100%, by the federal taxes that you and I pay to Ottawa. None of that money flows through Edmonton. None of it goes through this legislature or the Alberta government. So there is no tap to turn off in terms of Alberta government transferring money to Ottawa. I think there is a widespread misconception about that. And in fact, it's when you go and buy a cup of coffee at Tim's, 5% of that coffee generates the GST payment that goes to Ottawa, which a fraction of which goes out through transfers to the rest of the country that we do not get back in Alberta. There's no way an Alberta government can step in and stop that. We have no constitutional or legal levers, with one exception, and that would be the Canada Pension Plan. That's the one element of the transfer system in Canada where we could withdraw and make a substantial fiscal savings in the range of about $3 billion a year, again, because we have more younger workers paying into it and fewer retirees claiming benefits out of it. All right, Marco Jansen says, are you thinking about pairing the referendum with other electoral events or as its own? Great question, Marco. Yeah, the concept we've had is to do this referendum and potentially other referendums on the same day at the same polling stations as the October 2021 Alberta municipal elections. And this would be to save on administrative costs. It would also be more convenient for voters. It would also hopefully increase turnout for both the referendums and the municipal and school board elections. So I can tell you in our platform, we also committed to a referendum on seeking a constitutional amendment to entrench property rights. We have also, so that referendum would probably be held also with the municipal election next year. We've also committed to holding another set of Senate elections to nominate Alberta senators for future vacancies in the Senate. I remind you that 5 Albertans elected to the post have been appointed to and served in to continue to serve in the Senate, Scott Tanis and Senator Doug Black. So that Senate election would be held concurrent as well with these referendums. And there could be other things on the ballot. We've talked, for example, about the idea of an Alberta pension plan. Well, if the Finance Department comes back and advises us that on the whole, we believe a provincial pension plan would be a net benefit to Albertans, then we would proceed and most likely put that on the ballot on the same day in October of 2021. So I think that would be a great exercise in democracy. And lest some people say that that's overdosing on democracy, I think we haven't had enough of it in Canada. I think it would be a great example for trusting voters to make big and important decisions, including multiple decisions on the same day. And there are many places around the world, most obviously to our south of the United States, where on election day they will often have multiple different positions up for election and multiple referendums. And I have confidence that people can go to a ballot, vote for mayor, councillor, school trustee, and a couple of referendums and maybe a Senate position as well. I have every confidence in the civic responsibility of Albertans to do that responsibly. All right, Sean Ratcliffe says, please explain the benefit of having our own firearms officer. Thanks, Sean. So every province is allowed under federal firearms legislation to appoint its own chief firearms officer, and then that officer oversees a administration agency for the enforcement of the firearms legislation. The benefit is this. We would be choosing somebody who is focused on public safety. That is to say, on enforcing the firearms legislation to keep guns out of the hands of criminals rather than the pointless regulatory harassment of law-abiding citizens. So in other words, somebody from Alberta who understands Alberta, who understands the legal use of firearms as part of our heritage and culture, who understands the culture of safe firearms use amongst, for example, hunters, farmers, and sport shooters and others. So somebody who I would hope would bring an Alberta common sense perspective to the enforcement of the law. Now, they can't opt out of enforcing the law, but it's about the approach they take to enforcing it. Now, way back in mid-90s, I think it was 95, when the Chrétien government brought in the long gun registry that was then called Bill C-69, they invited provinces to set up their own provincial firearms officers. Ralph Klein, my predecessor, was thinking about doing that here, but decided not to because he thought it would be seen as somehow endorsing or validating the liberal long gun registry, which obviously Alberta was opposed to. In fact, we challenged it all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. But times have changed, and we've consulted with firearms owners here, and I think there's an overwhelming consensus in favor of taking this step. And let me finally say, Sean, that we have appointed as well a firearms advisory committee made up of a broad cross-section of people from the firearms community to advise us on how to structure a provincial firearms officer and ensure that we continue to fight most effectively the unfair federal gun grab that will do nothing to reduce crime. 1 second, please, folks. All right. And then Jason Mellinson has a related question. Where are we going with the new gun ban? Hunting season is fast approaching. Well, I think I just addressed part of that. Jason, bottom line is Alberta can't stop the federal government unilaterally from what it's doing. And that's been well established in our courts. I just talked about Ralph challenging the Chrétien long gun registry back in the mid-90s. Well, that went basically, Ralph and the Alberta government, together with Saskatchewan and some other provinces, went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. And our argument at the time was basically this, that the long gun registry consisted of property registration, which is a provincial power under the Constitution, and not criminal law. But the Supreme Court of Canada disagreed with us. It may have been a unanimous decision, but it was a very overwhelming decision. And then more recently, you may remember that after the Harper government, of which I was a member, killed the federal long gun registry, we repealed it, and then Quebec challenged that, saying that they wanted to keep the registry, or at the very least to keep the data that Canada had stored on firearms owners in the province of Quebec. That went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said no to Quebec. This is federal jurisdiction. So we've got multiple decisions, and we can't stop it. But we're doing everything we can through the creation of a provincial firearms officer, and we are very seriously considering legally supporting a responsible firearm owners challenge of the creeping liberal gun grab. I say it's creeping because it seems like every week they are expanding, not through bills before Parliament, but through ministerial regulation or RCMP policy. They're expanding the number of categories of firearms that they are seizing or effectively criminalizing. Firearms which have been responsibly owned and handled by law-abiding firearms owners for decades. All right, Abelardo El Jasser says, Mr. Premier, are you planning to visit the U.S. to discuss the ruling on KXL, that's Keystone XL, and the delays that this is causing? Yes, Abelardo, thank you for the good question. So, first of all, I'm pleased to tell you that there are no delays on KXL. Construction began in April as a result of our government's $1.5 billion equity investment to get construction underway. Just southeast of Edmonton, down around Oyen, there are hundreds of people already working on the pipeline here. They have placed the pipeline under the ground across the Saskatchewan-Montana border. There are segments already well under construction over the past 3 months in Montana, South Dakota, and Nebraska. And so construction continues with thousands of people working on the project, creating facts on the ground as a result of our investment. It's true that there has been ongoing court battles in the United States. Frankly, it would take me 50 minutes to unpack the multiple different court battles brought forward by groups from the Green Left that want to landlock Alberta energy. But at this point, those court orders and decisions have not slowed down construction progress this year. But Abelardo, yes, I do plan, as soon as I can travel, there's still travel restrictions between Canada and the United States, but as soon as we can get back down there, I absolutely will be back in the United States, forcefully lobbying U.S. decision makers on why it's in their interests to support Keystone XL. I'm pleased to tell you that every governor and state legislature on the pipeline route in the U.S. supports it, including a Democrat south of us in Montana, Steve Buick, and we have support from obviously the current U.S. administration. I spent several days in Washington back in February, and we were very well received in advocating for Keystone XL. And I'm not sure if the meeting is still on or not, but I'm hoping to get down to the Western Governors meeting to discuss this with fellow U.S. governors. We've also appointed former chairman of the House of Commons Finance Committee and former Alberta MP James Rajat to be Alberta's new senior representative in Washington. He's on his way down there now, and his full-time job will be representing our interests on issues like Keystone XL. Just one second. Janelle Yee says, how are you going to get a pipeline built then? Well, I just addressed that with respect to Keystone XL, our $1.5 billion investment plus the $6 billion loan guarantee next year, it would not be going ahead without that because of the political risk in the United States attached to that. So with that we have moved forward. Then secondly, there's, of course, the Trans Mountain expansion, which is absolutely essential. And that's, Janelle, it's so important for you to raise that because in this talk about a fair deal and our role in the Federation, I sometimes find that there are some folks who are understandably totally and exclusively focused on fighting Ottawa and maybe sometimes losing a bit of sight about the importance of getting those pipelines built. I mean, the two for me are totally connected. And the truth is that Ottawa, the Government of Canada, owns now the Trans Mountain expansion project. They bought it, as you'll recall, from Kinder Morgan. And so that is why we need to, on the one hand, continue to work with Ottawa on the construction of TMX, but on the other hand, also exert pressure and maximize our leverage. And that's what our whole strategy is designed to do. And then finally, Janelle, there's other very important pipelines, like for example, the Enbridge Line 3 replacement project. Fortunately, the Canadian portion of that has been completed, and that's added about 100,000 barrels per day of egress for Alberta crude. But we need to complete the portion going through Wisconsin to Minnesota, rather through Minnesota to Wisconsin. And there's been a lot of legal and political delays there. But I was just speaking with Al Monaco, president of Enbridge, which owns the Line 3, and they are optimistic that it will proceed. I had a very good conversation with the governor, a meeting with the governor of Minnesota in Washington in February about this, and I appreciate his support. So we are doing everything we can with our counterparts in Minnesota to move that forward. There are other pipelines which are in jeopardy. For example, Line 5, which has been operated by Enbridge for decades, takes about 600,000 barrels of Alberta crude to Michigan in the upper U.S. Midwest, fueling a number of refineries and producing most of the petroleum aviation fuel that goes into the Detroit airport, as well as most of the energy in southern Ontario. And there's a Democrat Attorney General in Michigan trying to block that pipeline. So that's why I went to Michigan and Ohio to meet with state legislators and governors to push back on that. So they're just, we have a constant kind of battle footing in terms of the defense of our interests on these pipelines. All right, Danielle, one moment, please. Danielle Vaughn Tkach, I think this might be Danielle's second question, says, our own police force is an interesting idea. What is the motivation for this? Is there a financial benefit? Thanks, Danielle. I agree, it is an interesting idea. We have not made a final decision. The Fair Deal panel recommends the concept of a provincial police force, but it does require a lot of technical study because there would be big cost implications. We would have to give notice. I believe we get a 3-year notice period to the RCMP that we would be canceling their provincial police service contract with Alberta. So why would it be a good idea? Well, let me start by saying that I think it would make a lot of sense in principle for Alberta to have a provincial police service that is based in this province, that is made up of Albertans, that understands this province, its values, its geography, its unique needs, the rural crime wave, and so many other issues. The RCMP is run out of Ottawa, distant place. They've got so many different mandates, everything from you can name national security mandate. They have federal policing mandate, personal protection, they have cybercrime, narcotics, they have, and yet at the same time, we hire them through the contract to police highways in Alberta and to do local policing in small communities. And so I think many would argue that the mandate of the RCMP has become too diffuse to really be appropriately responsive to the needs of local communities when it comes to basic local community policing. Let me make a second point. This is not a totally new concept. Alberta had its own provincial police force, believe it or not, back in the first 25 years of our history, between about 1905 and in the early 1930s. We had our own provincial constabulary. Quebec, Ontario, and Newfoundland all have their own provincial police forces. The Ontario Provincial Police, Le Sûreté du Québec, and the Royal Newfoundland Constabulary. And they all seem to do a credible job and have served their citizens well. So I think those are many of the... Now let me make one last, I think, important point. I think for a lot of folks in Calgary and Edmonton, perhaps Lethbridge and some of the mid-sized cities with their own municipal police services, they don't really understand perhaps what this debate is about because they already have their own local police that's responsible to their local communities in Calgary and Edmonton, for example. But in most of the rest of the province, certainly all through rural Alberta, some of our mid-sized cities like Red Deer and almost all of our towns, with one or two exceptions like Cardston. So like in 90% of the rest of the province, the default police service is the RCMP. So a lot of rural Albertans are saying to us, especially with the recent rural crime wave, the slow police response times to distress calls, the challenges in getting adequate personnel assigned to many rural police stations, which go track back into issues around RCMP bureaucracy and constraints on the training resources at RCMP Depot. Look, the point is this, they're saying to us, many people in rural Alberta, that they deserve the same kind of local and responsive police service in their communities that is Alberta-based and Alberta-run, that Calgary, Edmonton, and Lethbridge have in their municipal police services. So it's not an issue that would really affect Edmontonians and Calgarians, but it would make a significant difference and potentially a significant improvement in police services for rural Alberta. All right, Paul Newman says, will you consider fast-tracking the government's study on creating an Alberta Provincial Police before next year? Paul, we are going to encourage the bureaucracy, the public service, to get this done as quickly as they reasonably can. But this is a very big issue. This is not something that can be done in the back of an envelope. I've received already an initial briefing from the Department of Justice and Solicitor General on the issues that involved in prospective provincial police. It is, I mean, look, there would be negotiations over what do we do with the RCMP infrastructure? Would the province buy it? If so, at what prices? So what would the capital expenditure be? What would we have to do in terms of our own training? What would be the human resources rollover? Would we allow for a portability of RCMP officers here in Alberta into provincial police force? How would we integrate or deal with the Alberta Sheriff's Service and other Alberta provincial law enforcement agencies? So there are a lot of very complex questions. And I guess I would say this, Paul. We got rid of the Alberta Provincial Police back in the 30s, almost a century ago. We should take the time to do this the right way, deliberately and thoughtfully, being transparent with Albertans on all of the potential benefits and costs of this kind of transition. It's not the kind of thing that we want to rush or cut corners on. But you have my absolute commitment that this report will come out with the detailed study next year, and then we'll make an assessment about whether Albertans would be net beneficiaries of doing what Quebec and Ontario do with the provincial police service. All right, Ryan Grieve. Hey, Ryan. Says, hi, Jason Kenney, will the recommendations of the Economic Recovery Council be made public? I actually just got off a an hour and a half teleconference with the Economic Recovery Council, And actually, we've never tasked them with doing a report, Ryan. They've been more there as a sounding board. We go through an agenda. We meet by teleconference either every week or every other week, and we talk through a number of issues. But there's never been the idea of a formal written report. What I can tell you is that our government will be, towards the end of June, releasing our economic recovery strategy that will be a bold plan to recover from the COVID disaster, the global recession, the catastrophe in energy prices, with a bold strategy focused on both diversification and protecting people during this crisis period, as well as fighting for a future in our energy industry. And that plan will be based in part on the input we received from the brilliant people on the Economic Recovery Council, but they're not actually producing a report proper. All right, Jill Rosier says, I'd like to hear your thoughts and comments about the federal Liberals' decision to award SNC-Lavalin with a job to deal with orphaned wells. Why on earth wasn't this given to a company with oil and gas experience and/or an Alberta company? Jill, I'm not sure what where you're getting that information from, because we were successful in getting over $1 billion out of Ottawa as part of our fight for fairness as a job creation program to reclaim abandoned and orphaned wells. And that money is being transferred to the government of Alberta. It's not being spent directly by Ottawa, but by the Alberta government. And we've already launched I think we're doing 10 tranches or 10 stages in the program. So each one of them will be about $100 million in scope. They have already received and closed the request for proposals or bids on the first $100 million piece, and received, I understand, dozens of high-quality applications, and are making the decisions right now. So there's no federal contracting on this. It's all Alberta. We're doing this as best we can on a competitive basis. Obviously, we want steel moving here in Alberta with Alberta workers and Alberta contractors involved. We will obviously open this bid because we believe in free trade and competition. We want to make sure the taxpayers are getting a good bang for the buck, and that does include if there's companies from Sask or BC that are going to make bids on this, they're free to do so. But I fully anticipate that the vast majority of work will be done by Alberta contractors using local Alberta workers and subcontractors. So again, I'm not sure where that SNC-Lavalin thing comes from. If you've got more information on that, put it in the comments section below, and I'll be happy to take a look into it. All right, Josh Cadron, I'm sorry, and this is a COVID-related question, which is okay. When will Alberta move on to phase 3? Joshua, the answer is we don't yet know because we only moved forward on phase 2. Well, it was 10 days ago. And so what we have to do is watch the data that comes out of that. Now that we're basically, phase 3 is a very limited number of activities. It's mainly large events. I know that there are some other sporting things involved there, and maybe some other personal services. But let me just say this. Alberta, first of all, had less stringent public health restrictions than any province in Canada, and amongst the lightest restrictions in the Western world. I think there might be 3 or 4 U.S. Midwest states that were about as light as Alberta on our public health restrictions, and 1 European country, Sweden. But we were easily in the bottom 10% in terms of restrictiveness of our public health regulations during the pandemic, at the height of the pandemic. And we have moved forward faster and more broadly with reopening. We are by far the most open economy in Canada. I was talking to the president of the Royal Bank of Canada yesterday, and he told me that he was tracking credit card billings and saw that Alberta had a smaller contraction on credit card billings, which is a good measure of economic activity, than any province in Canada. And so that would support what I'm saying about how open, relatively open we have stayed, with 85% of businesses allowed to continue to operate at the height of the pandemic, representing about 96% of our economy. So, as I say, the vast majority of areas of activity are open, obviously with the careful constraints of our Chief Medical Officer. Indoor events limited at 50, outdoor events at 100, and physical distancing, frequent hand washing, all of those basic rules. I'm just so proud of Albertans and how responsible they've been through this. Even though we had lighter restrictions, we've had much better outcomes with a lower per capita incidence of hospitalizations, ICU admissions, deaths, and infections than the large Canadian provinces or that most of the jurisdictions around the Western world. So phase 3, I quite frankly expect, Josh, that there will be a gradual ratchet up to full opening. There won't just be one sudden move to phase 3. You know, for example, when it comes to large events, my understanding is that, my expectation is that Dr. Hinshaw, Chief Medical Officer of Health, will recommend to us gradual increases in permissible crowd sizes as we move forward through the summer, if the numbers continue to go in the right direction. And last I saw, there were 37 Albertans in hospital with COVID. That is down by about 15 people from when we went to phase 2, and it's down by probably 25 people from when we went to phase 1. So we continue to go in the right direction. All right, Louise Dupree says, how do you feel about Justin's loss of the UN seat today? Well, I have to say I have no idea why we went through the enormous expense and trouble of seeking a non-permanent seat on the Security Council. I think those of us who were in the Harper government wondered why we'd bothered to do that as well back in, 2015, 2014. Look, obviously, I think it's unfortunate that Canada did not win that vote. I do note that we received fewer votes from countries around the world under this bid today than we did under Mr. Harper's leadership several years ago. And I guess I'll just leave it at that. Brad Finney says, Joe Biden has discussed putting a stop to KXL. What happens if he's voted in? Thanks, Brad. So, first of all, we are reaching out to Mr. Biden's campaign, and should he be elected in November, we would work with his transition team to ensure he understands the reality that we're actually building the pipeline. I'm not sure he's aware that construction is well underway, and the critical piece, which is the border crossing portion of the pipeline between Canada and the U.S., is done. It's in the ground. And so we're working with the U.S. unions like the Building Trades and LIUNA, the steelworkers, the Teamsters, all of whom support this project. We will make it clear that Alberta, if a future administration seeks to revoke the presidential permit and stop construction after it's well underway, we will defend our interests, and we will defend them vigorously. We will defend them in court if necessary. And we fully expect that the Government of Canada would support us and make it plain that attacking a critical piece of economic infrastructure between our two countries, which is co-owned by a Canadian government, the Government of Alberta, would be a serious rupture, a slap in the face of the most important trading partner and ally of the United States. So we will make those points very clearly. All right. Sorry, I need to hydrate here, folks. Even though it's pretty humid up here in Edmonton these days, I don't know, I'm getting a little congested. All right, Ken Aluk says, hi Jason, I'd like an explanation on Bill 1. Is that a direct attack on First Nations people right to bring awareness to situations where our best interests are not met? And because the lack of proper consultation seems to be the problem, you mentioned in your campaign speech there would be proper dialogue with First Nations. Thanks for the good question, Ken. And I absolutely agree with proper dialogue with First Nations. I'm proud that within a month of our government taking office last summer, we brought together all 47 Alberta Treaty Chiefs for the first Alberta Crown First Nations summit in nearly a decade. We had spent almost a full day together talking about priority issues for First Nations, focusing on an agenda for shared prosperity and economic opportunity. We kept our commitment to create the Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, which is really one of the most exciting things Alberta is doing. That's backed up by $1 billion to backstop Indigenous co-ownership and financial participation in major resource projects. And I was just speaking in the last couple of days to Kenney Chief Roy Fox about projects under that, and as well as Treaty 6 Grand Chief and Enoch First Nations Chief Billy Morin about these economic development projects. We created the Indigenous Litigation Fund to support First Nations to defend their rights to economic prosperity. We held a second Crowned First Nations Summit here in Edmonton back in December, I believe, specifically to talk about the very challenging issue of children in care, to ensure that they are properly protected and retain connection to their First Nations and their culture. There's a lot more that we have done. I'm proud of it. We've created dozens of new treatment beds and places for Indigenous Albertans who are battling addiction at the Poundmaker Lodge, as well as the Blood Reserve down south, and many, many other projects. In terms of Bill 1, I do think, Ken, that there is some misunderstanding about this. It does not deal, at least in my view, with First Nations. What Bill 1 does, it's called the Defense of Critical Infrastructure Act, and has been passed by the legislature. What it does is simply to increase penalties for legal offenses which have existed for decades around trespassing on critical infrastructure. This would be things like railways and highways. And we are not creating new offenses. We don't have a criminal law power as a province. That belongs to Ottawa. But what it does is to update the penalties so that there is a greater disincentive for people to engage in dangerous, illegal trespass, like standing on a rail line or a highway, which can obviously jeopardize and threaten human life. So I really don't see this as being about First Nations. It doesn't create any new laws. It simply increases pre-existing penalties for things that have always been offenses. Indigenous folks and all Albertans continue to have the absolute constitutionally protected right to lawful protest. And that is in no way touched or inhibited by Bill 1. And we couldn't do that even if we intended to, because it would be struck down by the courts immediately if we sought to limit the right to lawful protest of Indigenous or non-Indigenous Albertans. So I've just asked that our Minister of Indigenous Relations, Rick Wilson, actually write to all the First Nations in Alberta explaining these facts and perhaps responding to some of the misconceptions which may exist out there. Finally, let me point out that obviously we brought forward this bill in the context of the large-scale illegal blockages that were occurring back in the January and February. Many, if not most of those blockages were happening in our cities with non-Indigenous people. These were not, I think apart from one or two very brief and very small protests on rail lines or highways in Alberta, that Indigenous Albertans were not involved in that. This is not, as some claim wrongly, targeting Indigenous Albertans. This is about the folks like, going to the GO train, that young college kids from Caucasian families primarily down in Toronto or Vancouver going and standing on rail tracks that had nothing, in order to oppose, by the way, the Coastal GasLink project, which is supported by all of the elected tribal councils in northern British Columbia. So as far as I'm concerned, these folks were jeopardizing human life and impairing our economy in order to oppose the economic wishes of the democratically elected leadership of First Nations. And I found that intolerable, as do most of the Indigenous Albertans with whom I've spoken about that. All right, thank you, Ken. Dayton English says, if Trudeau ignores the results of a referendum or we lose court challenges on C-69 or carbon tax, would you advocate for separation? No, Dayton, I would not. I have to tell you that my patriotism is not conditional. I will use every tool at my disposal to fight for and get a fair deal for Alberta, but I am not a separatist. I am not going to allow a prime minister with whom I disagree or a bad set of federal policies make me feel unwelcome in the country that my family, my ancestors have fought for well over a century. Albertans are patriots, and let me remind you that nobody that I ever heard was talking about separation when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister. Not to say that everything was perfect. The province continued to have issues and concerns, and there were structural problems in the Federation, like the way the seats are allocated in the House of Commons and the Senate, for example, that don't treat us fairly. But fundamentally, we had a Prime Minister from Alberta that was governing in a way sensitive to our interests, building pipelines, supporting resources. Stephen Harper gave Alberta 6 additional seats in the House of Commons, appointed our elected senators, repealed the Liberal Long Gun Registry, repealed the marketing monopoly of the Canadian Wheat Board to give freedom to our farmers. He gave Alberta fiscal fairness by going to per capita Canada Health Transfer. That was an extra $1 billion for the Alberta government, and on. Represented the interests of this province. So we weren't talking about separation then. So for me, while there are serious structural problems in the Federation, and Alberta has been dealt with unfairly through much of its modern history, it seems to me that most of the real problems that we're dealing with now economically emanate from the policies of a particular government. And I'm not going to let those policies make me feel unwelcome in my country and the country to which the vast majority of Albertans feel some sense of belonging. And finally, I don't believe there's any value, I don't think it's clever in terms of, I know there's a school of thought out there, and the Fair Deal panel alludes to this, where some Albertans say, well, we're not really 100% for separation, but we should be using it as a bargaining tool, as for leverage. Well, my view on this is you don't make a threat that you're not prepared to keep. And the polling indicates that about 25% of Albertans, after the last federal election, were saying they would support separation. When you pushed them a bit on that, that went down to about 15% who said they really believed it, and the other 10 or 15% were saying it was leverage. That's nothing close to a majority. And then let me finally say that we will be bringing in, as a government, as I committed to last November, profound democratic reforms that will ultimately give Albertans the say. So we will be bringing in a citizen initiative referendum law that will allow Albertans, if a certain percentage of them sign a petition, to force a referendum vote on important issues, particularly issues that us who are elected are not talking about. And so ultimately this will be an empowerment of Albertans. If they want a vote on certain issues, they'll be able to get those votes through the power of citizen initiative referendum. All right, again, 1 second, please. So next question goes to Richard Henry. Premier Kenney, how do you feel about the Tides Foundation having to rebrand? Is this due in part to the war room, and what else can we see coming out of this program in the future? Yes, Richard, I found that slightly comical. So for those not aware, the Tides Foundation is the Canadian branch of a huge U.S. Conglomerate. It is basically what they do is to take money from the foundations of U.S. billionaires like the Ford Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, the Hewlett-Packard Foundation, and then they transfer that money through their accounts. They send it up here to Canada to fund radical left-wing politics seeking to landlock the Canadian energy industry. They also, of course, fund those same radical causes in the U.S. that have been harassing pipelines, trying to shut down Line 3, oppose Line 5, Keystone, etc. So this has been they have been the largest participants in the highly coordinated and well-funded campaign to landlock Alberta energy. And we've been blowing the whistle on them. On election night last year, I said that as of today, of the last election, the Tides Foundation, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and the rest of them, I said their free ride is over. We are no longer going to let them to attack Alberta, our jobs, and our vital economic interests daily without a response. And so we threw a spotlight on them. And I believe their dishonorable, unethical conduct, their funneling of tens of millions of dollars from billionaires' foundations to attack working women and men here in Alberta. The same Tides Foundation that has been silent about OPEC oil, about Vladimir Putin's autocracy. The same Tides Foundation that has never funded a protest in Caracas, Venezuela, with the largest oil reserves on earth. That's never filed a legal challenge in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. That's never sought to elect MPs to the Russian Duma to oppose the Russian oil industry. They are bullies. They picked on Canada and Alberta because they thought we were Boy Scouts. They thought that we were the weakest kid in the playground. That's what bullies do. Well, we finally stood up and pushed back against the bullies at the Tides Foundation, and now they're so panicked they decided to go and change their name because they're afraid of living with the reputation that they have earned as an organization that is completely hostile to the jobs of working women and men in this province. So I think that's a small measure of our success. And let me just say, when it comes to that fight for our resources, you haven't seen anything yet. You ain't seen nothing yet. Dosen Borrell says, Mr. Kenney, what's happening with his illegal carbon tax scam? I like your style, Dosen. So just a reminder, we repealed the NDP carbon tax in Alberta, Bill number 1, in May of last year. Trudeau's government imposed their federal carbon tax on us on January 1 of this year. We went and challenged that in the Alberta Court of Appeal. We won on a 4-1 historic decision in February of this year. The federal government has now appealed that decision to the Supreme Court of Canada. We have told the feds that since they lost that, since the Alberta Court of Appeal has determined that their carbon tax is an unconstitutional violation of our provincial jurisdiction, that they have no business in applying it, but they've chosen to ignore this and go to the Supreme Court of Canada. So we'll have to wait for that appeal to be heard, together with pending appeals from the governments of Saskatchewan and Ontario on their carbon taxes, the federal carbon tax in their provinces. All right, John Deaver says, do you have more initiatives to further support the struggling energy industry in Alberta? Yeah, thank you, John. So the major initiative right now is the construction of the Keystone XL pipeline, which began in April because of our $1.5 billion investment in that project. Secondly, we have thousands of, and that's going to create 7,400 full-time good-paying jobs here on the Canadian side of the project this year alone. And you can just go down to Oyen to see rows of cats and tractors and heavy equipment being put into the field to create those jobs. Secondly, we got $1 billion out of Ottawa to get people to work in the oilfield services sector through accelerated reclamation of orphaned and abandoned wells, and that project is already moving forward. Thirdly, we have of course, this year with the collapse in energy prices, we're seeing, unfortunately, more capital spending being stripped out of the energy sector. So this is just going to be a super tough year. I think we all know that. But that's also why it's so critical that we move forward with the pipelines. Trans Mountain continues under construction. And the Indigenous Opportunities Fund, we're in advanced conversations about getting Indigenous communities to participate in some major projects like these. to help advance them, for example. And another big thing is the red tape reduction initiative, because one of the reasons we saw tens of billions of dollars flee the Canadian oil and gas sector to the US was that we became so rigid and slow moving in our approvals and our regulations. And so we're making great progress at streamlining our regulations, maintaining the very high standards while applying them much more quickly. All right, I'm going to maybe just, I think I've been at this for over an hour. So is that correct? Yeah. I'm going to take, Elaine Bruce says, one question, do you sleep, Premier Kenney? That's a lot of hours and issues to keep track of. Yes, I do, Elaine. I always joke, though, that I think sleep is overrated, but, and I should always probably get a little bit more, but Elaine, I got to tell you, these are very challenging times for our province, and there's a lot of people who have been losing sleep over the stress of it, over losing their jobs and the situation, they're losing potentially their businesses. So there's a lot of Albertans losing sleep these days, but I remain forever an optimist. You know, I'll just share with you folks, one of the most memorable and encouraging words I'd heard in the past 3 tough months came from a fellow who's actually a businessman in Quebec, the president of the National Bank. He said to me, Premier, it doesn't matter how low the oil prices go or how tough the situation gets this year. He said, Alberta will get through it and get out of it on top. He said, because there is nowhere in the world that has your greatest asset, your greatest resource. He said, it's not your oil and gas. Your greatest resource is your people and the entrepreneurial culture of Albertans. He said, I've worked all across Canada and all around the world, and nowhere have I seen anything like the innate entrepreneurial culture of Albertans. And he says it's that spirit of enterprise, that culture of entrepreneurship that will get you through this. I truly believe that. And folks, I want to thank you for your good questions. I'm sorry I couldn't answer all of them. We've been at this for over an hour. I will try to answer some more in writing later on when I have a chance. You know, the 25 recommendations of the Fair Deal panel are wide-ranging, but there's going to be a lot more chances to discuss these issues in the months to come. Please feel free to contact your MLAs and let them know what you think about these recommendations. You can check out the full report by going through the link in the comments section below. And once again, thank you so much for your good questions, your good suggestions, your encouragement, and most of all, your forbearance and your belief in the promise of this great province. Hope to do one of these again soon. Take care.